what we are looking for is not assimilation. What we are looking for is the different cultures being seen and thriving together. All right. And to do that well, people need both spaces. They need a space where their culture thrives with other cultures, but they also need a space where they can do their cultural things.
Hello and welcome to the Love the Stranger podcast. My name's Emily. I'm from Welcome Churches, and this week I had the opportunity of speaking with Harvey Kwiyani. Harvey is a theologian who was born in Malawi and now lives in the UK. And Harvey is particularly interested in areas of migration and theology and how they overlap. We had a really rich conversation, and I hope that you enjoy listening to this. I think this conversation will be a really good starting place for churches to start to grasp these issues and start to think them through. So enjoy.
Hi, Emily.
Hi, Harvey. It's good to have this conversation together this morning.
It's been a long time coming. I've been looking forward.
Yeah, we've been planning it for quite a while to pick each other's brains and think about some of the things that we have in common, I suppose, across Welcome Churches and what you're doing.
I think a conversation between us, a conversation reflecting on the work that we're doing is critical for the body of Christ, not just in our cities. In Liverpool, I think you're around Manchester somewhere here.
Yeah.
But and not just for London or Berlin or Paris. I think it's a critical conversation for the body of Christ around the world. This subject of Christian migration or migration in general, and what it means for churches and Christians around the world to be hospitable to one another, is an important conversation. So I'm glad that we can sit down and talk about this.
Absolutely. We keep getting requests from people from different church networks and things from different countries saying, oh, what have you done in the UK around welcoming refugees, and how have you mobilised the church? Because lots of countries are looking at this, and the church across the world is saying we need to do better at welcoming refugees and people who are displaced. And it's a big conversation, and it's a global conversation, as you say.
And I know that, we cannot talk about mission history without acknowledging the big role that the British church, British Christians have played past 200 years, past 500 years, and even longer than that. And I think that there are some things that if we can get right here in the UK, it becomes easier for us to actually give those things as a gift to the world. So if we wrestle with these conversations here and begin to get glimpses of this is how it looks like, it can become a gift that we can give to the world.
Yeah. And also how the world is blessing the UK as well. I think we see that at Welcome Churches, that as people are coming to the UK, and especially the forcibly displaced come to the UK, that our churches in the UK are being blessed by those people. And so it's not just the UK giving to the world, but it's the world giving to the UK as well.
Yes, and I said that in a sense that I think the question of Christian hospitality is a difficult one. It gets really tangled up quickly in the politics of migration.
Yeah.
What the politicians are saying about migration begins to inform how we as Christians think about hospitality and friendship to the other. And I think that I've lived out here in the West for quite some time now. I think that the diversity that we see here in the UK is quite different from what we see in Germany, what we see in the United States. This is a different kind of space. And in this space, we know that hospitality among Christians has not been really what it should be. And so there is still the questions about how can we be hospitable as Christians, especially as Western Christians, being hospitable to Christians who have come from other parts of the world. The political colonial history comes into play here.
Yeah.
How can British Christians be hospitable to Malawians and Zimbabweans and Indians, given the colonial history that we have? And so I think that if we get this right, given our history, British, African, Asian, Latin American, if we get this right here, in this unique kind of diversity, then there is hope that the world can begin to get things right somewhere. And it's in that sense that I say that if we get it right, it's going to be a journey. But if we figure out how we can be hospitable to one another, given our histories, we can then actually hold up and say, we have done it. This is what we learned. this is what did not work for us. And then when people ask, how are you doing it in the UK? It becomes something that we can say, this is what we did. This is what worked. This is what did not work. You can pick up what works for you and try and tell it for your context. But we have tried it here in the UK.
Yeah. You're right that it's become a political conversation. I think the other part of hospitality is how Christian hospitality in the past has sometimes been about power dynamics as well. And hospitality has often been a one-way thing. I give, you receive. And there's all sorts of unhealthy power dynamics that can happen in that sense. I think one of the things that I have tried to learn, and definitely am still learning as I have met people from different nations, especially those who are seeking refuge, is how hospitality needs to be a two-way thing. And as people arrive in my community, they need a place where they can contribute and belong and give. And I need to learn to receive as well as give. And I think that's something that we need to constantly be battling with, trying to address, rather than it becoming that unhealthy power dynamic, which I suppose is the bad side of our history in a way, isn't it? It's the things that the UK has more to be ashamed of, as when those power dynamics have gone wrong. And so as we try and get it right now, we won't get it perfectly right, we need God's grace in it. But I think the power dynamics alongside the hospitality is something that is really important to consider.
I come from Malawi, Southern Africa. Among my peoples in Southern Malawi, at least the way we understand it, hospitality really means giving the stranger, the guest, space to contribute to what's happening in your community.
Yeah.
Actually, we go as far as saying that, and this is said in a proverb, guest always comes with a pocket knife.
Okay.
Now, historically, the pocket knife is hidden, it's in the pocket, you don't know. But it's something that people would use, like I don't know what we would use to just, but it's a multi-purpose thing that you use for anything. Your goat gets tangled up in the weeds, you use your pocket knife to free it and things of that sort.
Yeah.
And when they say that the guest comes with a very sharp pocket knife, they're saying the guest comes with a fresh understanding that can help our community. So there is in that sense, in our understanding of hospitality, a space to listen to the stranger, a space to give the stranger a microphone so they can speak, because they come with a different set of eyes. They may be the thing that we need to help our community move forward in one way or another.
Yeah, that's a really interesting proverb. I think it's a good analogy, because a pocket knife can also be misinterpreted. And, you could say you started with suspicion. If someone had a pocket knife, you might think, oh, they're going to draw that on me and they're going to use it for bad purposes. And so it really depends on your posture to start with and your attitude to start with, on whether you're ready to receive that gift and that perspective. I can definitely see from a British perspective how we maybe have misinterpreted gifts that people have been ready to offer. And when we've treated people with suspicion, they haven't been able to share those gifts.
That's true. And I mean, generally speaking, the people that use this proverb are not thinking in terms of this guy can pull his knife on us. They are expecting that this person has a fresh perspective.
Yeah.
That can help us see our problems in a different light. And maybe that's what will unlock this community to do what it needs to do.
Yeah, but the host community need to be ready to receive. They need to, and I've definitely seen that in our work with churches in the UK, is that when churches have changed their attitude and said, we're ready to receive, we're ready to welcome people and to receive from them as well, that completely changes the dynamic. And it has ultimately meant that those churches have been more blessed, because they have been able to see the gifts that new arrivals have been able to offer, rather than seeing those people as a burden to the church or to the local community. They've seen them as people to contribute and enrich society, and that's made everybody's experience so much better. But for the host community, I think there's a big thing for the UK church to learn to learn. We need to learn from people who arrive in, which is a huge journey to go on, but a really exciting one, I think.
I mean, we're in Britain, we're in the West. Historically, Westerners have done the teaching. Everybody else has been learning from. And I'm not saying that the West should stop teaching, but the West should start learning as well. Right?
Yeah.
God has given gifts to the Africans, the Asians, the Latin Americans that Western Christians need to receive.
Definitely.
And so it's that posture of, yes, we come to the table with something to give, but we also come with open hands to receive what God has for us. I argue. I use the analogy of Paul's body of Christ, especially in Ephesians 4:16, where he says the body is glued together by the mutual exchange between the gifts. Between the members exchanging their gifts, so that actually the vitality of the body, the life of the body, is really shaped by the mutual exchange between the members. Each member has to give, each member has to receive.
Yeah.
And historically, the West has, I mean, it's the individualistic culture. Everybody has to be self-contained. I don't need to borrow anything from my neighbors, all that stuff, and just makes it difficult for Westerners to receive, right? But where people can receive from the gifts that God has given to the body around the world, they will be enriched.
Yeah, maybe that's the part of the Bible that springs to mind as you were talking then was when Jesus says, unless you let me wash your feet, you will have no part of me. And, I find that very hard myself. To let somebody serve me is a very hard thing in my culture. And yeah, I think that's a big challenge for the UK church as a whole to learn to let people serve us rather than always being the ones giving and doing. We like to do a lot. We like to have an activity rather than to be with people.
Yes, there is that, but there is also the power dynamics, right? That we cannot listen to the Africans, the Asians, the Latin Americans. We brought Christianity to them. What do they have to tell us? And I hear that often. It's not a secret. People say that. Oh, we brought you Christianity. Now you come, you want to teach us theology. That just doesn't make sense. So it's part of what is that challenge that some people still feel like, we know everything there is to know. We have everything that is to be had. And therefore, what can these Africans, what can these Latin Americans, what can these Asians bring to the table? Especially if you're a refugee, that's part of the challenge.
It's a huge challenge, yeah. But the world has changed, hasn't it? And is continuing to change. And I think, our UK churches are seeing the consequences of that. In my church, we have had a few different missions happening recently. And so some of the people who have come to help our church with mission. So we've got 2 interns. One of them is from Malaysia. One of them is from the Czech Republic. In the mission week the other week, we had people from Brazil and people from Germany coming to do that. And these were all volunteering opportunities that were available to British people as well. But it's the global church that are now taking up those mission opportunities. So we're seeing that on a very local level, that it's people beyond the UK who are coming now to do mission in our local community. And the world is changing, and we see that very pertinently. Those people haven't been refugees, but we see that particularly with refugees who are coming to live in our communities as well, and others who are coming to live in our communities. They're bringing new energy and new life to our local churches as well.
The fastest growing part of the church here in the UK and in Europe in general for the past 30 years or so has been the migrant church. And among those, it's been the African church that's been growing the fastest.
Yeah.
Here in the UK, that has only changed in the past 2-3 years with Hong Kongers coming in. And so the fastest growing church in the UK at the moment are the Chinese Hong Kong churches. Now, I do think that that's an important piece of information for church leaders to wrestle with. Something is shifting, something is changing. But I think that actually, as much as church leaders need to wrestle with this, I think mission organization leaders need to pay attention to this. Because pretty soon, mission workers, mission partners, missionaries will certainly be non-Westerners to a large extent. And part of the reason for that will be actually because Western mission organizations are having problems recruiting as much as they did before. Just as much as they're having problems with finances. It's not flowing the way it used to. So again, that shift in the demographics of British Christianity and the shift in the demographics of people available to work in mission needs us to rethink a few things. So it highlights the need for us to actually deal with and talk about this question about hospitality and how we work together as a group of followers of Christ from every part of the world living together on this small island.
And I think it's that mission is two-way now. It's not just the UK going, but it's people coming to the UK as well. And as people move around the world, what impact that has on mission. But yeah, I think there's a lot for us all to learn. I think one of the things that I find really interesting in the refugee conversation. So yes, over the last few years, we've seen our churches being particularly blessed through people coming from Hong Kong and joining church communities. And we have seen that at Welcome Churches, that we have been blessed as an organisation by being able to partner with Chinese churches and with OMF as well, and the different partnerships that we've been able to learn from each other about doing cross-cultural mission and ministry and learning how to be church together, and including churches from different backgrounds within the wider conversation within communities as well. So I think in the past, maybe the diaspora churches have kind of been outside of churches together groups and things like that, whereas now we need to learn from each other, and those are becoming more cross-cultural. There's still work to be done, but we're learning from each other more than we have done in the past. But it's also been really interesting how the Iranian church has come to the UK and has connected with white majority churches more. And that has been an area where there has been very little investment from major denominations or major organizations saying, we see that God is at work here, we're going to invest financially. That church is growing without the financial resources behind it, which is interesting compared to other things that we invest in. And there's just so much learning there, isn't there?
I'm in Liverpool. There's a good, strong Iranian community here. I think several, maybe last time I heard there were like 3 Iranian congregations in the cathedral. You're right. Those are surprising ways that God is working in the world today. And many of those Iranian Christians are becoming Christians here in the UK and joining churches here. Some of them will take the gospel back to Iran, but many of them will evangelize fellow Iranians here in the UK. Now, I do think that to bear witness for Christ in a context of cultural diversity like we live in the UK here means that actually we need to also be seen doing everything that we do through the lens of cultural diversity. How does the world see us as we follow Christ in this world? When the world looks at us, is it looking at small white communities here, Asian communities there, African communities there, Latin American communities there? Or actually, can it see us as together as one, the way Christ wanted us to be? That, I think, becomes a great part of our testimony. When Jesus says it is by love that the world will know that you're my disciples, love requires an other. There has to be an other that you can love. Otherwise, you can't just love yourself. And really, in this context today, it's the love among followers of Christ, different cultures, different skin colors, different languages, different accents, and yet living together in love, following Christ, worshiping together in love. And that becomes part of our testimony. So yes, we can celebrate that. Yeah, there are congregations that are emerging, Nigerian congregations, Ghanaian congregations, Kenyan congregations, Nepalese congregations, Brazilian congregations. Yes, there is all that, but I think there's need for us to go a step further. And in going that step further is when issues of hospitality begin to emerge. How can we be hospitable to one another so that we can receive from one another, so that we can share the gifts that God has given us for one another? And that we really cannot do well if we are in isolated silos. It really begins to work out if we actually get together in close proximity. Some of these things we can't do remotely. You have to be in the same room. I always say that you need to be close enough with people who can ask you the difficult questions. Why do you do things this way? Why do we always sing this song this way? Why do we arrange our chairs like this? Why don't those people speak in our gatherings? There has to be somebody who has a different set of eyes who will ask you difficult questions. That is where hospitality begins to emerge. When you can actually sit down and take those questions and not be defensive and cause them to rethink some of the things that we do. That is hospitality, but it cannot be done remotely. It has to be done together, doing life together. Different colors, different cultures, but doing life together.
Yeah. And the cross-cultural aspect of that can make it quite difficult to ask those questions, because different cultures will ask those questions in different ways. And some might ask quite directly, why do you do that? And some might ask it very indirectly or wait to be asked, rather than, all those kind of cross-cultural navigations are a fun journey to go on, aren't they?
Oh, yeah. I work with a lot of African pastors who've come with a lot of pastoral experience from the continent, a lot of preaching experience, and they get here, they get to these churches, and they're waiting forever to be asked to do something.
Yeah.
They cannot go up and ask, can I do something? They're just waiting and waiting and waiting.
Yeah.
And because they're not getting those chances, they just get frustrated. One day they walk out and start their own churches.
Yeah. And then the local leader might be waiting for them to offer.
Yes.
So everyone's getting frustrated.
Why didn't they tell me that they can do this?
Exactly.
I'm like, did you ask?
Yeah. I think the other part of that as well is, so I've read a little bit around social integration theory and what people need to integrate. And there's some thought that people need to be able to cross the cultural boundaries into the local culture, or to understand people from different cultures. But you also need a place to belong in your own cultural identity as well, and to acknowledge and celebrate that. And I think in our churches, that can be quite a difficult thing to get right over, does everybody need to adapt to one major culture in the church, or how do we have spaces for different cultural identities within a church community that means that people are getting what they need in terms of what they need to integrate and relax and feel at home.
I explore bits of this in my book, Multicultural Kingdom. And generally speaking, when people say multicultural churches, and now the fashionable term is intercultural churches, they mean really churches with people of different skin colors, mostly. And maybe they may come from different cultures, but once they get in this church space, it's always one culture that dominates, and everything has to stand up to that culture. If it doesn't meet the requirements of that culture, that thing is foreign and it's going to be rejected. And that is what I would consider like cultural assimilation, right? Once you're in this space, you're assimilated, you lose your cultural identity, you assume this new cultural identity of this group that has basically one culture. It doesn't matter how many cultures are there, how many peoples are there, but it's living up to this one culture. As far as I understand, that makes sense. I think it's people who do that are doing something good, but I think we need to go a step further again to a place where what we are looking for is not assimilation. What we are looking for is the different cultures being seen and thriving together. All right. And to do that well, people need both spaces. They need a space where their culture thrives with other cultures, but they also need a space where they can do their cultural things. So that when they come to the wider group to bring their cultural gifts, they are authentic cultural gifts that have come with them being Malawians or Ghanaians. Right. And when they are giving their gifts to everybody is actually receiving a genuine gift that's come from a different part of the world, rather than leave your gifts, come here, and then you assimilate, and then we do everything the same. We need both spaces.
Hi, Samuel here. We hope you are enjoying the Love the Stranger podcast. Every year, thousands of people arrive in the UK with stories of war, persecution, violence, and poverty, hoping for a happy ending. Instead, they often face isolation, hostility, fear, and loneliness. Now more than ever, a welcome from a local church can make all the difference, changing their story from fear and isolation to one of acceptance and belonging. This is for people like Abbas, who said that his local church in the UK gave him a new family to belong to after his family was killed in his home country. We want every refugee in the UK to receive a warm welcome when they arrive in a new community, and we can do it through the power of the local church. Could you become a story changer today by committing to give regular to the work of Welcome Churches? Your monthly gift will make a refugee feel welcome all year round throughout the UK. Visit welcomechurches.org/donate. Thank you.
Now, I think that part of the challenge for us having this conversation now is that probably we are really the first generation wrestling with these issues. The diversity that we are seeing, I was just looking at the statistics from the 2021 census, the diversity that we are seeing. And to make sense of the data from the statistics, you're starting in 1991 when non-white people in the UK were only 7%. Now it's 18% in a period of how many years? 30 years.
Yeah.
All right. So that's a sharp rise.
Yeah.
And it's that rise that makes it necessary. That rise in the populations of people who have come from other parts of the world to the UK in the past 30 years, that makes it necessary for us to have these conversations. Will we get them right? I think we'll make mistakes. We're all learning. But I think that doesn't mean that we cannot aspire to do right.
Yeah.
And so the aspiration for me in this conversation is, can our churches be places where different cultures are seen at play in church?
Yeah.
Sing a Swahili song and sing a Spanish song and sing a Korean song in church. Let people from those cultures actually lead those things so they can show you how their culture does things, but at the same time allow them space where they can meet together to do the Swahili thing or the Korean thing on their own. And so we live in both worlds so that both worlds can be enriched and can exchange the gifts that God has given them for one another.
Yeah. It's a really exciting vision, I think, to see that. And I do truly believe we will more fully represent God's kingdom when all the nations are worshipping together. I think one of the things I know we've talked about before, Harvey, is I've kind of seen over the last few years, especially in the UK church, there have been different conversations happening that cross over to some extent, but then have also been quite separate. And so there's been one conversation happening around intercultural church and what does that look like for the UK church? And there's been another conversation happening around racial justice and what does racial justice look like for the church? And then maybe to a lesser extent, but then there's also the conversation about welcoming the stranger and migration and forced displacement as well. And in some ways, at times, these conversations have felt quite separate. And they are different issues, but there are crossovers as well, aren't there? And I'd be keen to hear more of your thoughts over how those things work in our churches together. I
lived in Minneapolis a good 7 years. I experienced a life in Minneapolis that actually convinced me, and I heard this in Minneapolis. I think it's a common saying, but I heard it first in Minneapolis, that justice is what love looks like in real life.
Yeah.
Such that actually, if we love one another, we will be involved in issues to do with justice for one another. And racial justice is one of those pieces that we need to work on. So we ought not separate racial justice from our faith life. Those things need to inform one another. If we love one another, we want justice. For one another. I do think that issues to do with racial justice, and I'm speaking this as an African, as a Black African, I grew up in Africa. Issues to do with racial justice. Many of us who grew up in the continent of Africa don't really realize we are Black up until we land in Europe or in the United States, right? For me, that happened in Germany in 2001. I experienced it again when I moved to the UK, and then I experienced it again when I went to the United States. And then I began to realize, actually, there is an issue in the body of Christ that even theologically, some of us are not able to see the connection between issues to do with racial justice and issues to do with our discipleship, our faith life, as members of the one body of Christ, as Christ has called us to himself, has made us one in himself, has flattened the hierarchies, the social racial hierarchies that the world has put in place for one reason or another. Christ dismantles them. He brings us together. He creates one new humanity. And so one of the shockers of my life was to wrestle with theologians who did not see that racial justice is an important issue for the church, whose very theology justified the racial segregations that we see in the world and the abuses of power. I mean, a very good example is the apartheid era in South Africa. Yes, apartheid was a political system, a social system, but it started out as a theological answer to the issues of especially the Dutch Reformed Church and the Dutch people who migrated to South Africa. Right? And I do think that theologies like those need to be challenged.
Yeah.
For us as followers of Christ, yes, there can be first class, second class citizens in the body of Christ. But I do think that actually theology requires us to see all humanity through the same lens, right? That God doesn't have favorite sons and favorite daughters. He is one God and the God of all humanity. So yes, racial justice, I feel passionate about it.
Yeah.
Because I've seen what it can do. I've said before, my time in Minneapolis showed me things that I could never understand when I was in Africa.
Yeah.
Issues to do with migration. Migration is a human condition. People migrate. It's just life. If birds migrate, if fish migrate, if animals migrate, why should we ever think that we can stop humans from migrating?
And God's people migrate. It's a biblical story, isn't it? That God's people are on the move.
You take migration out of the Bible, the whole story falls flat. There is no story at all. Right? It's in the process of Abraham's journey from Mesopotamia to where Israel is today that he becomes God's friend. Right? He comes to the promised land. His family ends up in Egypt a good 400 years. They have to migrate back to the promised land. They live in the promised land just a few hundred of years. They are scattered. Babylon and Assyria and many other places. When Jesus shows up, the New Testament, when the church is born in Acts chapter 2, it takes advantage of the migration of the Jewish people that had happened for centuries. But this whole story is not possible without migration. Right? And so, and when we look back in church history, mission, the expansion of the church, the growth of the body of Christ has happened largely due to migration. Yes, there have been a few missionaries here and there. And when we look back at the 200 years, we tend to think like it's the sending out of Western missionaries that has led us to a place where we have world Christianity today. That's just a small portion.
Yeah.
In the 1800s alone, a quarter of Europe's population migrated. That's like 6 to 8 million people, Christians, taking their Christianity with them. And they migrate because of economic reasons. There's land in South Africa, or there's gold and diamond in Zimbabwe. Let's go. There's land in Kenya, right? That's just the British. And the French are moving, and the Germans and the Americas. I didn't even mention the Americas. There is land, there is opportunities in North America, Brazil, Argentina. And it's this migration of millions of European Christians for economic purposes that spreads Christianity from Europe to the rest of the world in ways that it could not happen if it was just missionaries. So I do think that one of the challenges that we need to wrestle with as we see the shift from, of course, Western missionary movement to global missionary movements will be this question of migration. Because many Christians who are migrating from the rest of the world to the rest of the world, including the West, are not migrating as missionaries. They are migrating as students, skilled workers, refugees. All right. And they carry their faith with them as they travel. Here in the UK alone, the largest African church in the UK is the Redeemed Christian Church of God. Almost 1,000 congregations. In each of those congregations, there will be at least 2 pastors. Right. So you're talking just Redeemed Christian Church of God, 2,000 key leaders in the UK. If we were to count them as missionaries, there would be thousands upon thousands of African missionaries working in the UK. But they're not registered as missionaries. They're not working with mission agencies. They're just here and living out their faith and leading their own congregations. But they are migrants and taking their faith with them. The Redeemed Christian Church of God says that they are actually active in 197 countries around the world. 197 countries, that's almost the entire world. But they did not send missionaries to 197 countries. It's just the migration of Nigerian Christians that makes this possible. And because now migration becomes a key issue in the way we frame mission in this century, it takes us back to the question of hospitality. What do we do when the stranger shows up at our doorstep? Yeah.
So would you say that the answer, I don't know whether you can boil down the answer so simply for big questions such as migration and racial justice, but the answer to these big questions is hospitality?
Now, migration and racial justice, that's another brilliant connection, because I have a friend, a British friend who worked in Africa for a long time. A few years ago, he sent a tweet on his Twitter page. He said, "I've lived in Africa for more than 10 years. Nobody has ever called me an immigrant." Right? And in my response to the tweet, like, I'm called an immigrant every day here. And that is to say that migration, at least the way we frame it in Western conversations, is an un-Western problem that we need to solve. But it's other people, it's the black and brown people who migrate. As Westerners, why British people don't migrate? They can go around the world as expatriates.
Yeah.
And so that's where there's a connection between racial justice and migration. When we talk about racial justice, we need to realize, especially as connected to migration, we need to realize that actually the problem is the othering of the others. That people who are others, people who are migrants. And again, here in the UK, we saw this, how people responded to Ukraine versus Syria or Sudan, right? And so we realize that actually to turn this thing around, we need to shift the way we think. Right. Of course, talking about the problem of migration, that's a political speak. How do we as Christians talk about migration in the light of the fact that we follow an immigrant God? It has to be a different conversation. I usually give the example of, I think it's Deuteronomy 26 verse 5, where they gathered together on what we call Easter Sunday today. So the Sunday after Easter, they would, this is in the Old Testament, they would declare together, recite, "My father was a wandering Aramean." Right? Like this has to be part of our identity, that our father in the faith was an immigrant. The King James adds, he was a wandering Aramean about to perish. Like life had been squeezed out of him in the process of migration. And yet this is our father. So as Christians, we need to talk about migration, I think, differently from the way politics talk about migration. And the question is, how do we make that shift happen?
We need to, you're absolutely right. We need to talk about migration differently to the politics. Our experience at Welcome Churches is that it's the politics that makes people talk about migration. It's when the headlines come that people suddenly pay attention again to issues of refugees and people seeking asylum. It's because of the headlines that people are at least willing to have the conversation. And when the headlines go, people forget the conversation very quickly. And I think that's also a challenge to the church, is not to let all of our agendas be dictated by the headlines as well, because fundraising is always hard, but it's slightly easier when the headlines are about migration than when the headlines aren't. And when the headlines go, people move on to something else very quickly.
And that calls for us to actually talk theologically about migration in ways that will help Christians think differently about what's going on.
Yeah.
Right? That I'm writing something at the moment, and one of the issues that's come so strongly upon me is the migration of Jesus as a child to Egypt, right? And how, in the context of the Roman Empire, and Alexandria has more Jews than Jerusalem at this point in time. So he is just joining the Jewish diaspora that's already been scattered, right? And before he comes home to Nazareth, he has been an immigrant. He has lived in a foreign land. He has been surrounded by people who are not his people. And that shapes how he understands the world when he comes back to Galilee, which Matthew calls Galilee of the nations, right? And it's Galilee because there are many nations, there are so many Gentiles living. Some scholars have argued and said, actually, Jews were a minority in Galilee.
Right.
And so in preparation for that, he has to spend time in Egypt. When he comes back home, he is already being shaped by foreign cultures.
Yeah.
And that's the Christ that we follow. How dare we refuse to engage with migrants when the Christ that we follow was an immigrant running away from danger in his own country?
Yes, I full-heartedly agree with everything you said. It needs to become more central to our church conversations. It can't be something on the edge of who we are. It needs to be a central part of our identity as followers of Jesus.
I mean, I wonder how only when something happens, and then, yes, we'll talk about migration, but otherwise, it's not a subject that people talk about.
And when we do talk about it, it's very short, so it can be it's boiled down to welcome the stranger, and that's it. Whereas actually the theology is that's a really important thing, but the theology is so much richer, isn't it, and so much deeper than that one verse. Yeah.
But we are all, one way or another, strangers. We are all sojourners. We're all pilgrims. And if we are all pilgrims, if we're all sojourners, we have to be a bit more kinder to one another on this journey than we tend to be.
Which comes back to the point about learning, because those people who experience more obviously the need to be a stranger and that experience of being a stranger can teach the rest of us who are meant to be living as strangers on earth. There's things that we can learn about living as a stranger on earth as citizens of heaven from those who arrive obviously as strangers.
That is so true. I think there's a reason. When we get to Acts chapter 2, the way I read the story, I see Jesus has brought these Galileans to Jerusalem. It's been a 3.5-year journey, but in the end, they are in Jerusalem on a day when the Jewish diaspora is in the city. And what happens in Acts 2 is the connection between the Galileans and the diaspora. So that before long, the story begins to get dominated by the diaspora Jews. Barnabas, Paul, John Mark. These are people who have already experienced what it means to live in another culture. And they become the people who take Jerusalem, at least leaders in Jerusalem, along the way. They hold people's hands along the way. This is what's happening. God is doing these things among the Gentiles. Help us deal with it. Help us figure out how best to deal with a Gentile Christian. And it's in that process that people like Peter and the other apostles begin to realize that actually this thing is bigger than just Palestinian Jews. But the key is in the fact that people who have already experienced it are eloquent enough, can articulate it well enough that people who have not experienced it can understand it. And it's in that articulation that as we communicate about this, people will be able to learn, especially from people who have experienced. But actually, yes, the Spirit of God is calling us to the other. And as it is calling us to the other, let's begin to imagine what that looks like as we work and live with the others who are already among us. How can we be hospitable enough for them to give us their gifts, for them to receive their gifts, for us to do life together?
Yeah. Thank you, Harvey. We've covered so many different things, and it's been really, really rich to have this conversation. And I hope that it will bless others as well.
Thank you. This has been good.
Definitely.
I look forward to doing something like this again in the future.
Absolutely. Maybe we should make it a regular thing.
We can do that. Thank you.
Take care. Thanks, Harvey. Thank you for listening to the Love the Stranger podcast, a podcast brought to you by Welcome Churches. You can find out more about Welcome Churches' work, including how to donate, at welcomechurches.org. Please like and review, share and subscribe to our podcast to help us spread the word.